All right, welcome back everyone, fellow peers and advanced students. Let's dive right into this explainer because today we are taking on a truly rigorous deconstruction of Chapter 23 of the MMK. Now, in our previous sessions, we've walked through Nāgārjuna's brilliant dismantling of external phenomena, causality, and motion. We've covered a lot of ground, but honestly, the stakes today are significantly higher. We are looking at one of the absolutely last and definitely the most stubborn dualities to transcend. Chapter 23 goes straight for the jugular. It attacks the very foundation of the spiritual path itself. We're talking about the division between right and wrong, wisdom and ignorance, the salutary and the unsalutary. This chapter is a profound, unsparing examination of our foundational errors. It actually asks us to completely let go of this deeply ingrained idea that we have inherent impurities that we need to systematically destroy.
So here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the triad of impurities. Then we'll deconstruct those three spheres. Third, we'll dive into the illusion of opposites, followed by going beyond conceptual proliferation. After that, we'll talk about transcending the middle way, and finally, abiding in primordial suchness.
Okay, kicking things off with Section 1, the triad of impurities.
To really grasp how we get caught up in our samsaric tangles, we have to start by defining viparyāsa, and we need to focus our lens right at the very top of the wheel of dependent origination. So viparyāsa basically refers to those foundational cognitive errors that spark all of our false dualities. And it's crucial to understand we aren't just talking about minor perceptual mistakes here. These are incredibly insidious cognitive perversions that serve as the primary engine for karma. Because of ignorance, we look at the world through this deeply distorted lens. We see things that are entirely impermanent and we treat them as permanent. We look at empty, dependently originated phenomena, and we instantly, almost reflexively, judge them as inherently salutary, meaning intrinsically good or virtuous, or unsalutary, meaning intrinsically bad. This specific cognitive error, this reification of the pure and the impure, is the initial spark that literally lights the fire of our suffering.
And that brings us to the exact triad of impurities we're going to dismantle today. It works like a chain reaction. Step 1, we have the causes, our errors or perversions about what is good and bad. Step 2 is causality, which is the actual production or mental fabrication known as prapañca. Now, as advanced practitioners, you know how vital it is to understand the mechanics here. Prapañca is that psychological process where our mind frantically churns these erroneous views into complex, emotionally charged narratives. And then at step 3, straight out of this fabrication, we get the effects, the impurities or defilements themselves, the classic root poisons, passionate attraction, aversion, and delusion. So we intellectually label something as inherently salutary, our mind fabricates a whole story around it, and the mechanical result is the defilement of lust or grasping. Conversely, we label something as unsalutary, and it mechanically produces hatred. It's a closed loop.
Moving right along to Section 2, deconstructing the three spheres.
All right, let's do the intellectual heavy lifting here and run this triad through the ultimate Madhyamaka stress test. We're going to apply our familiar tetralemma to prove these three spheres, causes, causality, and effects, cannot possibly exist in any extreme or absolute state. Let's look at the dyad of separate versus united. If the initial error, the cause, is inherently separate from the impurity, the effect, well then an impurity like hatred could just spontaneously arise completely independent of any error, which obviously destroys the entire law of dependent origination and contradicts our direct lived experience. But flip it around. If they are entirely united, then the cause is identically the effect. That means no actual production takes place at all, which is equally absurd. What if we test self-existent versus other-existent? If causality is self-existent, it doesn't need any prior condition. It would just exist eternally, freezing reality in place. If it's other-existent, you immediately fall into an infinite regress trying to find the ultimate other. Whether we test to see if these spheres are continuous or discontinuous, permanent or impermanent, multiple or one, dual or non-dual, if we try to pin down any of them using this, non-this, both, or neither, the logic inevitably, entirely collapses. They completely refuse to be boxed into our dualistic ontological categories.
Nāgārjuna actually states this incredibly directly in verse 2. He says, "Those things which come into existence, presupposing errors as to what is salutary and unsalutary, do not exist by their own nature. Therefore, the impurities do not exist in reality." Notice the heavy emphasis on swabhava there, own nature, or inherent existence. The crucial takeaway here is this tautological loop of emptiness implies emptiness. Think about it, because the initial errors, our conceptual judgments of what is salutary and unsalutary, lack any inherent existence. The mental fabrications built right on top of them must also be entirely empty. If the cause is empty, and the mechanism of causality is empty, there was literally no way the resulting impurities can exist in absolute reality.
It's fascinating to notice how Nāgārjuna completely inverses the traditional Abhidharma causal chain here. The Abhidharma treats these defilements as real, albeit momentary, afflictions that you literally have to wage a war against. It's an exhausting methodology. You are endlessly chopping down these weeds of defilement that just continually grow back. But Nāgārjuna shifts this. He moves us away from a linear purging of real impurities toward a direct, piercing insight into their absolute non-substantiality. I mean, if there's no inherently real self to even possess these impurities, and the objects of our desire and hatred are completely empty, what exactly are you trying to destroy? Madhyamaka realization is waking up to the fact that the weeds are holograms, the defilements are already empty.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, the illusion of opposites.
This is where we need to firmly note the union of the two truths. The spheres of error, production, and impurity are merely co-imputed designations by the mind. They are interdependent and co-emergent. To give you a super concrete example, the concept of long cannot possibly exist without implicitly relying on the concept of short. They mutually define each other. In the exact same way, you cannot define salutary without simultaneously co-imputing unsalutary. Now, conventionally, yes, for sure, we can and do use these tools to navigate moral action in our daily lives. But from the perspective of absolute truth, they are entirely empty. There is absolutely no real opposition and no real relation between opposites, because there are no inherently real opposites to begin with.
To drive this home, Nāgārjuna uses these classic, vivid analogies to describe the there yet not there conventional nature of the three spheres. Let's just take a moment to savor the poetry of the source text here. Think about an echo. Why is an echo the absolute perfect metaphor for a defilement? Well, an echo requires a voice and a wall to exist, right? It is dependently originated, and you hear it vividly. It seems very real, yet it has no intrinsic voice of its own. You can't grab it, you can't box it up, and when you really investigate it, nothing is truly there. Our defilements, our errors, and our rigid conceptual divisions of right and wrong operate exactly like these echoes, or like dreams and mirages. They appear functionally vivid to us, but ultimately they are completely hollow.
All right, Section 4, Beyond Conceptual Proliferation.
Now we have to apply the generalized tetralemma to really smash these triads and models. This affirms that the true nature of the three spheres completely escapes all of our dualistic dyads, whatever this happens to be. Whether we are debating if the self is eternal versus non-eternal, if consciousness exists after death versus does not exist after death, if phenomena are with self versus without self, the reality of these spheres is not this, it's not non-this, it's not both, and it's not neither. And crucially, listen to this, there is absolutely no fifth option. Human consciousness is desperately addicted to the idea of a fifth option. We constantly try to find some hidden, solid ground to stand on when all four logical corners fail us. But Madhyamaka reasoning relentlessly, unapologetically pulls the rug out from under every single absolute conceptual stance we try to take. So we must conclude that the triad of impurities exists strictly beyond all of our conditioned, dualistic conceptual proliferation, or prapañca. Let's face it, our brains are meaning-making machines. We effortlessly generate triads and dyads, good and bad, pure and impure, subject and object, but reifying these models, treating them as absolute reality, is exactly what keeps the wheel of samsara spinning. Our addiction to mapping reality and confusing our little map for the actual territory is the very root of suffering. The true nature of reality is beyond any conceptual model or dyad we could ever possibly construct.
Which takes us to Section 5, Transcending the Middle Way.
If our maps are just conceptual proliferations, what is the right attitude to have? Well, this paradox perfectly demonstrates that the best attitude is the middle way, which is completely free from all extremes, even the concept of the middle itself. Listen to this brilliant, head-spinning question from verse 25. If any kind of self-existent impurities do not belong to somebody, how in all the world would they be eliminated? Who can eliminate that which is non-self-existent? It's checkmate. If an impurity actually had solid, unchanging inherent existence, it would be permanent. You could never, ever eliminate it. But if it doesn't have inherent existence, it's an illusion. So who is eliminating what? You simply cannot kill a mirage.
So how do we practice a path without reifying the path? We can still use the wheel of dependent origination conventionally, but we must do so lightly. The middle way means we don't fall into the extreme of nihilism either. We use the concepts of salutary and unsalutary relatively, as highly useful tools but never in absolute terms. This brings up a core tension in Madhyamaka. How do you strive for liberation while deeply knowing both striving and liberation are empty concepts? You do it by applying conventions without absolute effort. You play the game of conventional reality, but you play it lucidly. You practice compassion and ethical discipline without the rigid, heavy grasping that comes from believing these things have some absolute intrinsic essence.
Finally, Section 6, Abiding in Primordial Suchness.
This brings us to the ultimate realization of Chapter 23, transcending the map altogether. Since everything is dependently co-arisen and entirely empty of inherent existence, nothing is inherently broken or fundamentally stained. Therefore, we might as well perceive everything as primordially equal, pure, perfect, complete, divine, and one. We must simply abide in reality exactly as it is. In the tradition, this is tathata, or suchness. And I don't mean one as opposed to many in a dualistic sense, but a reality entirely beyond the very concepts of many, one, both, or neither. Now, as advanced students, you know this is perhaps the most audacious and challenging claim in the entire text. We spend so much of our time on the spiritual path trying to get rid of our ignorance so we can finally attain wisdom. But Nāgārjuna demands we drop even that. The ultimate duality of ignorance versus wisdom needs to be entirely abandoned. For a dedicated practitioner, this is simultaneously terrifying and completely liberating. The duality of samsara versus nirvana, ordinary being versus Buddha, pure versus impure, it's all co-imputed. You simply cannot have the concept of absolute enlightenment without tethering it to the concept of absolute delusion. If everything is empty of inherent existence, the entire wheel of dependent origination and all elements within it collapse as absolute truths. I mean, what really is right and wrong? What is permanence and impermanence? What is purity and impurity? What is self? What is samsara? What is nirvana? When you deeply analyze these pairs through the lens of emptiness, you realize they are entirely illusory. Yes, the wheel of dependent origination is a spectacularly useful conventional model for diagnosing relative suffering, but it's just a map. It is absolutely not the ground of reality as it actually is. There is absolutely nothing to accept, reject, or purify in absolute terms. Just let that sink in for a moment. We arrive at the profound realization that reality is entirely beyond all dualities, triads, models, maps, and conditioned dualistic conceptual proliferation. There is no inherently impure ignorance that you need to painfully chisel away to find some hidden glowing core of pure wisdom. The impurities, the errors, the defilements, they are just conceptual fabrications. The very moment you stop fueling them with the belief that they are inherently real, they naturally subside right into tathata. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder as you integrate this deep Madhyamaka realization into your own practice. If you don't have to constantly wage an exhausting battle against inherent impurities, if there is no absolute right or wrong to anxiously grasp at or desperately reject, what does that profound freedom actually feel like? How will you walk through your day, using conventions skillfully and ethically, while abiding quietly in the completely pure suchness of reality as it actually is? Think on that. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will catch you on the next deep dive.